Welcome to the Strong Teams podcast. My name is Steve Neesmith.
And I'm Rodney Cox.
And Rodney, I'm excited today because we've got an interview for our listeners. Who are we interviewing today?
We're interviewing Jeff Brown. Jeff Brown is an award-winning radio producer and personality, and he's also the host of Read to Lead, the podcast. Now, if you've not subscribed to that podcast, I'd strongly encourage you to do it. We'll put a little link down in the description below to help you get there. He is one of the top business podcasters, and he's the author of Read to Lead. Jeff, I'd like to thank you for joining our podcast today at strongteams.com.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. This should be a lot of fun.
Yeah. So, just kind of warm up our listeners here that are unfamiliar with Read to Lead, the podcast, and help them understand really what it is and what your goals and objectives are and why maybe they might want to subscribe.
Yeah, I got really passionate about reading as a habit about 20 years ago, thanks in large part to a boss, a mentor that I was fortunate enough to work with. I hadn't considered reading prior to that big of a deal, all that important to my personal and professional growth. And he altered my thoughts, and that helped reignite what had been a dormant passion for reading. I had that as a child. It went away. School educated it out of me, along with the desire to want to learn, as school sometimes does. Maybe that's not your experience, but that was mine. And so I left college being glad that all the quote-unquote learning was done. Now, I didn't have to do that anymore. Fast forward about 10 years, and I sort of had a pivot in being introduced to business books and nonfiction in particular. And that passion continued pretty steadily for 10 years. One day, I was just on my way home from I worked in radio. I was on my way home from the radio station, and I was counting up the books I had read. This was like in March, and I realized I'd read about a book a week, and that was more than I was aware of. I hadn't been keeping count. I thought, wow, that's a book a week. And when I said that out loud in the car, it was almost like this light bulb went off, and I was like, huh. I kind of thought of podcasts as these weekly things. All the ones I listened to were weekly at the time. And I had been kind of kicking around the thoughts of doing one for several years and just thought, well, what would I do a podcast about? I don't know. And so when I said that in the car, I was like, hey, maybe that's that idea I've been looking for. I'm already reading a book a week. How fun would it be to interview the authors? Selfishly, maybe there's some free books in the process too. And boy, has that ever been true. And I just kind of started brainstorming it from there. That was March of 2013. By July, the podcast had launched. And coincidentally, a month before that launch, I got let go from that job. And so
wow.
I thought, well, maybe this podcast will be something I can turn into a business. And fortunately, that happened. Not right away, but eventually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Leadership comes in a lot of different forms, right? So we think of leadership as boss to subordinate a lot of times, but I think about the leadership principle exercised by that mentor, right? That individual that influenced you to say, hey, have you thought about this? And, reading might help you get where you're going. And so tell us a little bit about that leadership concept, not just being boss to subordinate, but leadership might be, come in a lot of different formats.
Yeah, it certainly does. For me, when I started the podcast, as much as anything, it was about making books easier to consume for people. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of ways to do that. There are a lot of book summary apps out there these days and that sort of thing.
Right.
But I wanted to create a way people could engage with the book right from the author through a series of questions, and so. That to me seemed like a sort of an on-ramp to maybe more reading, an on-ramp to more books. I think it's so pivotal. Reading, learning, and growth is so pivotal to leadership. You don't know everything.
Yeah.
And reading also is not enough.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's an important step in the process, certainly, but it's not by any means the last one. So regardless of what kind of leadership position you're in, or even if you don't have the title
right.
of leader, I mean, this is another thing to think about. We're all leaders. We all influence other people.
Yep.
And so we're all leaders in some sense. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not at a place where you're willing to admit you don't know everything and not willing to go outside your comfort zone and push yourself, then you're not going to be leading effectively for very long.
I love that. I love that, Jeff. I also love that you were such an early adopter of podcasting. Do you think your radio background made that jump a little less scary because you really got in on the game early?
Yes, it did. There were a few things that I needed to kind of wrap my head around, but it certainly gave me a head start. I remember people telling me early on, a few months into the podcast, Jeff, you sound like you've been podcasting for like 20 years. And I was like, well, I kind of have.
Right.
I did radio for 26, so I had a little bit of head start. For most people, I'm not a stranger behind the microphone, and so I did have a bit of a head start that way. And it was a medium that I took to quite naturally, as you might imagine. And had you told me in 1987, dating myself here, when I started in radio at age 21, that what was exciting to me then was my voice being heard in the community would eventually become my voice being heard around the world, and that I didn't need to leave my house for that to happen, I would have thought you were insane. and for the to see this democratization of this technology, as we've seen in so many different industries, happen in a relatively short period of time has been pretty amazing.
Absolutely. How many episodes have you done now?
It's coming up on about 450, so it's been a little bit over 9 years. And for the first 4.5, 5, I missed a week. I do podcast episodes every Tuesday, and I missed a week here or there. But since December 2017, I haven't missed a Tuesday. And so if I can keep that going a little bit longer, I'll have a 5-year streak going. But yeah, we're coming up on, I think it's like 444, 445, something like that.
That's inspiring.
Absolutely. Very, very inspiring. And I think about guys like me, like I'm on the road all the time and I'm traveling and I'm always working, picking up a book and reading it. I don't consider myself a strong reader. The ability to actually listen to a podcast, get some real time, listening in around some core concepts typically will invite me into a book a lot easier, where I'll go, I really like that concept. I'm going to pick up a copy of that book and I'm going to actually dig into it. So it helps me sometimes as a leader just kind of catch something that I might be really, really interested in and then go deeper in that. So talk to us a little bit about that different style, right? That person that is an avid reader, that's a leader, versus that person that's more auditory and likes to listen to what they do.
Yeah, I think that any form of reading, I often have people kind of be thinking that, a physical book or is better than an ebook. An ebook is better than an audiobook. And I don't put any judgments on those. I think, first of all, just read whatever, kind of format it is. Something's better than nothing. For years, when I first started my reading journey, I had convinced myself, wrongly, I would say now, that the only time I had to read was in the car on my commute to and from work. And so I leveraged that time, sort of what Zig Ziglar called automobile university back in the day. I would leverage that time to read and to listen to books and learn that way. Certainly, I think if you're going to dive deep, if you're going to read nonfiction, let's say, and oftentimes with nonfiction, what follows reading a nonfiction book is a to-do list of the things that you want to implement. Now, not always, but a lot of times, it's easier to make that transition from reading a physical book to a to-do list oftentimes than it is maybe some of these other formats. It doesn't have to be that way, but for most that tends to be the case. And that's the format I like the most. I like just sort of feeling a book. I like turning the pages. I like kind of understanding, when I read something, like where that was on the page and what side of the book it was on related to, where it may be mentioned or referenced somewhere else in the book later. And I kind of have that sort of spatial relationship with a physical book that you don't have with an ebook, and you certainly don't have with an audiobook. But again, whatever you can do, whatever feels right to you with regard to reading, whether it's listening, whether it's an ebook that you're highlighting with your finger, or a physical book that you're marking in, you're writing in, and yes, that's okay to do. I think any one of those is better than nothing.
Yeah, so it sounds like to me it's a lot more about the knowledge, right? We ascribe to this principle, like what you don't know, what might be much more important than what you do know. And then once you discover that knowledge, that new piece of information, how will you apply that in your life in order to lead differently tomorrow than you led yesterday? And so talk a little bit about the power of that knowledge. What we don't know might be more important than what we do know.
Yeah, and it's important to understand too that, and this is kind of goes to what I was hinting at a moment ago, that reading is the first step, but it's not enough. They say knowledge is power, but I would disagree with it. I would argue against that. I would say only knowledge put into action
I
is
agree.
actual power.
Great point.
We've got to learn to make this step of, I could read 5 books about, let's say, public speaking, and think that because I've done something that 98% of the public has not done, that compared to them, I'm an expert on public speaking. And that may be true compared to them.
Yep.
But if I'm going to go give a talk on public speaking, let's say to a group of wannabe public speakers, I might be able even to plan that talk effectively and deliver it and truly sound like I know what I'm talking about until the Q&A. And if all I've done is read, that Q&A is really going to test how much I know. The critical next step with any kind of content you're consuming, whether that's books you're reading, whether that's videos you're watching on YouTube or say TED Talks, or podcasts you're listening to like this one, or articles you're reading on the web, it's about the notes. You've got to be able to gather your own thoughts being generated by those things you're consuming and write those down. I'm a big believer in that writing is thinking. And unless you've done the writing on what you've learned, you've not really done the thinking that needs to go with it.
I think that's a great point to camp out on here. I think that the action that you take in note taking is so important. And I know as I've led teams, I often have I've learned that myself. I've advised my team members to do that for so many different reasons. And I think that generally just action is so important. I think that, we've got so much information flowing at us. It's not hard to find leadership information these days, and you can consume so much of it that I think you can fool yourself that you actually have become a leader when in fact you really have not taken the action that's needed. And so I just think that's a great point, Jeff.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's the knowledge that puffs up, right? And so if we're not careful, we're going out, we get that knowledge, puffs us up as a leader, thinks it gives us the acumen that we need, but we have no practical knowledge. We have no wisdom around it. And so, we definitely ascribe to the same principle. We want to take what we learn, we want to put it into action. We want to do that with a servant's heart. We want to do that looking to the needs of others above our own. We want to esteem them higher than ourselves. We want to take the knowledge that we're learning and apply it so that we can lead more effectively and we can lead more. We want everyone to flourish. And it's those principles that we apply in our teams that helps everyone flourish, not just me. And so very, very important. I agree with that.
I think there's, if I can interject, I think there's two main reasons that more people don't read. And maybe for leaders, there's a larger percentage of leaders who read than, say, compared to the general public. But either way, those numbers could stand to go up. I think we've seen the stats, we've seen the studies. A lot of people don't spend a whole lot of time, reading these days.
Right.
You learn things you didn't already know, and you learn what you were wrong about when you read. And those inherently are the two reasons people don't read more than they do or don't want to read. It's because, number one, people don't want to learn. And that sounds odd at first blush. And when I first sort of internalized that, I thought, well, I love to learn. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. The guy in Jeff in his 20s did not. He left college, remember, not wanting to do that anymore.
Right.
And many people haven't had that sort of moment I did where I had that love for learning and reading reignited yet. And so people don't want to learn because learning means admitting we don't know something, which we're taught to avoid. And so it's easier to not learn and just get back to work. And the other reason that people don't want to read is because what was the reason? They don't want to change their minds. If a book is going to help us get somewhere we've been unable to get to on our own, that means we're going to have to change our minds about something. So learning and meaning that we're there's something we don't know, and changing our minds, meaning that we could be wrong about something, are two things that make us very uncomfortable.
Absolutely.
Any worthwhile pursuit is going to require a certain amount of discomfort. I mentioned Zig Ziglar a moment ago. I think it was him who said, "Don't let what you want now get in the way of what you want most." And I think that's what too many people are doing. They're letting what they want now get in the way of what they want most, which means there's a feel good now that gives me that dopamine now, and I'm going to put off the reading or the hard thing until later. Well, then later comes, and we wish we'd already done that, because now we're experiencing regret right? For not having done that thing we could have done, 6 months ago or whatever it is.
Absolutely. We primarily serve the faith-based space and help leaders trying to get along better with their teams. And that the core of our principle is Romans 12:1, right? What does it look to actually transform our minds? What does that actually mean to renew our minds? Then it's in this very space. It means that there are certain things that we think are true that we're applying in our leadership principles, and we're not getting the fruit that we're looking for. And so now what we do is we start blaming everybody instead of actually trying to discover, what is it that I need to renew my mind about? What principles am I applying or not applying that's not getting the fruit that I'm looking for? And then when I discover those principles, I will have the most difficult decision that any human being or leader will ever have, because it would require humility in order to admit that I've been following this misconception, right, or this lie, and now I need to take that thought captive, and I need to do something different tomorrow than I did today. I might even need to seek certain individuals' forgiveness that I'm leading, right, in the way in which I've been leading them, or the environment in which I've been fostering, or whatever the case might be. So humility, is the glue of a leader being able to learn that new principle, be excited about the principle, and then do whatever it takes in order to glorify God, in what they do, and especially as they lead others. And
so Jeff, inquiring minds want to know, how many books would you say that you read a year?
For the show alone, it's generally 52, one a week.
Wow.
This year I've done a couple of solo episodes in the last few weeks, and so it's probably going to be closer to 50. But then, in addition to that, maybe another 10. So I would say probably around 60 a year.
wow,
a little more than one a week, not quite.
That's great. That's great. I'm glad I asked. I knew it would be a larger number than the number I could say. I do not read close to that many books, but that's fantastic.
Well, let me add this, Steve, and I think this is important to point out. When I say read, I don't mean that I have read every one of those books cover to cover. And I think that's a misnomer, a mistake a lot of people make, that a book's not read unless I've read 100% of it.
Okay.
And with nonfiction, I would implore you to write down, before you read any nonfiction book, why am I reading this book? What is it I want to get out of it? Why did I pick it up in the first place? Why did I buy it? And write that down on a piece of paper and identify what that is. Then go to the table of contents and look at the chapter titles and determine, well, what parts of this book, it may not be the whole book, it may be, but it may not be, what parts of this book right away get to that goal I'm trying to reach. Start with those chapters. Maybe that's chapter 3, 5, and 7. Then once you've read those chapters, if you can look at that goal you've written down on a piece of paper and come to the conclusion that you've reached it, having read those 3 chapters, guess what? You're done with that book. It's a read book, or you can be. You don't have to finish it, and you can go on your Goodreads account or wherever you announce it to the world and say, I've read that book, and say it with a straight face and with an honest face, because you did what you needed to, or got what you needed to get in order to go where you needed to go.
That is great advice. And I think that makes reading books so much more accessible to folks when they hear what you just said, Jeff, that it's really about, increasing your knowledge. And I just think that that's one I'm going to remember, one tip I'm going to remember from this discussion.
Absolutely. And so that the inquiry minds want to know, right? So like over the last 52 weeks, I would be interested to know, what was the most interesting thing that you've learned, right? Like if you write this question down, I'm reading this book with this thought in mind. What is the most interesting thing that you learned, and maybe most transformational to you as an individual? Like once you learned that principle, you said, wow, that's going to make a difference in my life, both personally and professionally tomorrow.
Yeah, a couple of specific books and topics come to mind. I read a book by a guy at West Point named Dr. Nate Zinsser called The Confident Mind, and it's a book on mindset and just unpacking how we and he's not the first to write about this topic,
Right.
obviously, but how we tend to talk to ourselves. We talk to ourselves in ways we would never allow or put up with another human being talking to us,
Hmm.
right? In that way, we are our own worst critic, and it's really about just calling that out and recognizing that for what it is. Another book I read recently that helped me realize that I'm not a father, and that I don't have to be a father to learn from a guy who is a father who's written a book to his son who has just turned 18. It's called 18 Words to Live By, A Father's Wisdom on What Matters Most. And I've got it in my hand right now because I just interviewed him recently. Some of those words are, you got to narrow it down to 18. That's a tough thing to do. But responsibility, courage, empathy, generosity, creativity, authenticity, faith, freedom, identity, gratitude, resilience, integrity, forgiveness, those are some of the 18 words. But
Oh, I've got to pick that up.
I went into it thinking, okay, this was a father to a son. I'm a son. My father's passed on, but I'm not a father. And is this going to resonate? Well, boy, did it ever resonate with me. And that was really eye opening for me.
Wow. So now that we're kind of on that father son topic, I would like to just have a brief discussion on how you see relational capital as a core concept or a core attribute of a leader. In other words, if you don't have relationship with someone, like what's going to cover over our mistakes, right? What's going to be the glue that binds us together? So how would you see relational capital in leadership today?
Oh, I think it's huge. I think back to when I started my podcast and the things that interviewing business people, authors has done for not just my business but for my life and the way it's enriched my life. I never realized when I started an interview-based podcast, it didn't dawn on me that it was going to have that kind of impact. The relationships I've been able to build and friendships I've been able to make, many of them I don't see face to face very often, but I know I can call upon. I think back to when, and I'm just a personal example here. When my book came out last year, about a year before that, I had to reach out to folks about whether or not they'd be willing to write an endorsement for the book or a blurb to go on the back of the book, that sort of thing. And I was a little nervous about that because I thought, well, I'm a first time author. I've got this podcast I've been doing for a few years, but whatever. I was blown away. But I got a yes from every person that I asked except for one. And that person who turned me down was only because of a scheduling conflict and an inability to commit the time to read. And so relationships are everything. I mean, I think back to the last real job I had, that last radio station, and the relationships my mentor established inside our team, and the trust that we built. We read books together. We read books like The Five Dysfunctions of a Team by Pat Lencioni early on, and understanding the issues with the absence of trust or the fear of conflict and those sorts of things, and understanding those concepts and reading about them and learning from him about them and Pat about them really helped us become this tight knit group that we haven't been together for 10 years. But every time when August rolls around, we all used to attend the Global Leadership Summit together. When that thing comes around, we all text each other and reminisce about how fun it was to work with each other because of the team that we built and the way that we did it.
Speaking of relational capital, Jeff, I'm curious. You've interviewed a lot of leaders on your podcast. Have there been any leaders? I know you're not going to have favorites, but are there any that you just think, wow, I can't believe I'm about to talk to this person. I've dreamed of talking to this person. Are there a couple of leaders that you can tell us about that really kind of fulfilled maybe a professional goal of yours, or just that you were just kind of wowed by the experience?
Yeah, the first one that comes, there's several. The first one that comes to mind is Seth Godin, who's one of my favorite authors, written about 20 best-selling books, and just a really generous person. But when I had that love for reading reignited in me, 20 years ago. The book that relit that sort of ember, if you will, not to drive the metaphor in the ground, but was a book called Purple Cow by Seth Godin.
Yes.
And so, then 12 years removed from that, I'm having a conversation with him for 45 minutes, just like we're having right now. And so that was like a really full circle moment. And to be able to share that with him too, that his work reignited this dormant love in me that had been dormant for, the better part of 20, 25 years. And so that was huge. I had a chance to interview a couple of years, 3 years in or so, John Maxwell, which was a real treat. Liz Weissman is a favorite author of mine and wrote a book called Multipliers that I really dug when I was at that last radio station. I've had her on like 4 times now. I got to interview Alan Alda, the
Wow.
MASH star
Yeah.
once. He wrote a book about communication when he was 81. I think he's probably 84 or 5 now. It's been a few years ago, but that was a real treat. My wife had her ear to the door the whole time wanting to hear that conversation. But yeah, those are a few that come to mind.
Oh, those are great. Those are great. I applaud you for developing a podcast that impressive folks like that want to be a part of. So that's great. Those are great examples.
Absolutely. Jeff, you've already talked about, the power of reading and the importance of reading and kind of given us some amazing tips and what that might look like. But you made a statement earlier on that without taking the notes, you've not actually thought about it. That's the thinking part. And I'd be curious to know a little bit more about this course that you produced called Note-Taking Mastery, and help us understand a little bit more about the power of note-taking, maybe that concept that you're now helping people understand in mastering this thing of taking notes.
Well, thank you so much for asking that and giving me the chance to talk about it, because I'm really passionate about this right now. And when I first launched it, I called it Note-Taking Mastery.
Right. Yeah.
And then I changed the name. It's now Note Making Mastery, because I think that's a key difference. There are note takers, and all of us are note takers to some degree. But I think that the true difference makers, those who are internalizing the knowledge and actually doing something with it, are what I call note makers. And so there's kind of a 4-pronged process to that. It's collection, connection, crystallization, and creation. Or collect, connect, crystallize, and create. So initially, there's the collection or capture process. What are the tools that we're going to use? What do we capture? How much? And what are the tools we use to do those things? Everybody, I think, who is a note taker or desires to improve in that space needs to have what I call a central hub, sometimes referred to as a second brain. And that can be, a physical notebook. More often than not, it's for most people, it's some sort of notes app. I use an app, for example, and I think your note-taking style will inform, the app you choose should you go the digital route. And so then the next phase is connection and organization. Secondarily, it's like how do I best organize my notes? Because that's something I find that virtually everybody who comes through my course struggles with. They can't find what they want to find when they need to find it. And they're also not using a system, guys, that connects new ideas to existing ideas effortlessly in their system. Then the third prong is to crystallize. That's a sort of fancy word for develop and distill your notes. And this is the really maker part of it comes in, is especially when you're consuming other people's content. Maybe you're taking notes on this podcast and you're writing things down that one of us has said verbatim, is what we often tend to do. But at some point, we've got to get to a place where we're taking other people's words from the content we've consumed, in addition to our own ideas and thoughts, and putting those thoughts of others into our own words, and paraphrasing and summarizing, and also adding to, and taking those thoughts and ideas to the logical, or maybe sometimes not so logical, next step. So that's the crystallization part. Then the last part is simply create. And that's where we take what has happened up to now and we create something new with it. That doesn't have to be necessarily in public like we would think with an author or a blog or a podcast or something like that. It could be with that presentation you got to deliver next month or whatever, a conversation you're going to have tomorrow. And it brings you to a place where when you get to the point you want to create something, When you're ready to create, what we often face is a blank page or a blank screen. That was what prevented me from being an author earlier than life than what I was able to accomplish, is because I hit that wall of the blank screen or the blank page. But when you follow this process, when you actually sit down to begin to create whatever that is, 70, 75, 80% of the work has already been done.
Yeah.
And now all you've got to do is just connect the dots, and create this cohesive narrative between the building blocks, the knowledge assets that you have accumulated.
Yeah, that's excellent. Early on in my on career, I found it difficult if I were taking notes, and scribing notes, and I would do that in a notebook, and then I'm going back, where are those, and so on and so forth. It's so hard for me to keep up. And I've always kind of been a techie at heart, so I started using just the standard, notes function inside of the Apple system, the Apple ecosystem and Gmail ecosystem, and then cataloging that. And now, through the power of search functions, I tend to be much more visual oriented. I can kind of remember that thought, and I'll go, I remember that thought, and I can easily search that back up and read about it and so on and so forth and go deeper. So yeah, the power of those four functions I could see being just transformational for sure.
If you really want to level that up, I mean, it's one thing to remember something,
right,
and be able to go back to it. But what that means is oftentimes we only go back to our notes when we remember a specific note. And
right.
and what can happen in your case, I don't know that this is true or not, but what can be happening in the background is your new ideas are siloed away from existing ideas. And you may have notes you've taken, and this is certainly the case for me. I'm 56, so this happens more often than I like to admit. But notes I've taken as recently as 3 weeks ago, I've already forgotten about. And unless there is a system that tears those silos down and ensures that serendipitously new ideas are going to connect to old, a lot of that note taking ends up being wasted because I haven't been reminded for some reason of that thing that I took 3 weeks ago.
Great point.
Great point. Absolutely. Amazing. So Jeff, tell our listeners how they can get involved in that. Tell us, I'm interested in getting involved in the note making mastery. So tell us a little bit about how they can get involved, how they can read more about it, or take your course even.
Well, yeah, thank you for asking. I really appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's real simple. You just go to jeffbrown.me.
Okay.
I'm not narcissistic or anything. jeffbrown.me. And there you'll see, all, well, not all, but most of, I'm transferring everything to a new platform. I've got a few things still to carry over. But when you go there, you'll see a couple of options for note-making mastery. There's a self-paced option that if you just want to, take it on your own time and go at your own pace, you can do that. Then there's a sort of live cohort option. We just started this week, cohort number 3, the week that we're taping this. I do them every couple of months. I think the next live one's going to be in January. So there's those two options, a live version where you can have some group coaching, and the current iteration also includes a one-on-one session with me. And then the self-paced version, again, on your own, but it's also a little bit cheaper.
Yeah, we'll put all that information down also into the comments area in the bottom. But it's, once again, sounds simple to me. Go out to jeffbrown.me, not narcissistic me, but jeffbrown.me, and you should be able to find whatever you need. So, Steve, you got any more questions of Jeff before I close us out?
No, just a comment. Just it's been such a pleasure talking with Jeff today, and I'm so glad we did this interview. And just I've learned a lot.
Yeah, Jeff, and the same for me. I'm so excited for our listeners. We've got listeners all over the world, and I'm excited that they'll be able to hear and learn more from you, Jeff. And I hope they engage everything that you do, because I think it'll make them a much stronger leader. And so, thanks again for having us, and we're grateful for you, Jeff. Keep up the great work.
Thank you so much, guys. I really appreciate the invitation.